February 23, 1945, 10:37 in the morning. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stood in his underground command bunker 75 feet beneath the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, holding a message that had just been decoded. His hands were steady, but the paper trembled slightly. Not from fear, from the vibration of American naval shells impacting the surface above, a constant thunder that had been shaking the island for 19 days straight. The message was from one of his last functioning observation posts on Mount Suribachi. 3 sentences, brutally efficient. Enemy Marines reach summit at approximately 10:20 hours. American flag now flying from highest point. Position untenable. Awaiting orders. Kuribayashi read it twice. Then he folded the paper with precise movements and placed it on his desk alongside dozens of other reports, each one documenting the systematic destruction of the defenses he'd spent 8 months building. But this message was different. Mount Suribachi was more than a tactical position. It was the first thing visible when approaching Iwo Jima from any direction. A 550-foot volcanic cone dominating the southern tip of the island. And now, 4 days into the American invasion, the stars and stripes flew from its summit. He looked at his staff officers. 6 men, dirty and exhausted, their uniforms crusted with volcanic ash and sweat. They'd been fighting without sleep, eating 1 meal per day, commanding 21,000 troops from this buried fortress, while the world above them was systematically obliterated by the largest concentration of American firepower ever assembled against an island target. "Send acknowledgement," Kuribayashi said quietly. "Tell them to hold as long as possible, then withdraw through the tunnels if they can. The battle for Suribachi is over." One of his officers, a major named Hori, spoke carefully. "General, should we inform Imperial Headquarters? The flag on Suribachi will be visible to the entire American fleet. It will be photographed. The propaganda value will be significant," Kuribayashi interrupted. "Yes, send the report to Tokyo. Tell them the truth. American forces have taken Mount Suribachi after 4 days of assault. They've achieved in 4 days what we hoped to deny them for 2 weeks." After the officers left to transmit the messages, Kuribayashi sat alone in the bunker, listening to the artillery barrage above. He'd known this moment would come. Had planned for it, actually. His defensive strategy for Iwo Jima had been built on a simple, brutal truth. Japan was going to lose this island. The only question was how long they could make the Americans pay for it. 8 months earlier, when Kuribayashi had arrived on Iwo Jima to take command, he'd walked the entire island. 8 square miles of volcanic rock, barely large enough to matter on a map. But strategically, it mattered enormously. Iwo Jima sat 660 miles from Tokyo, exactly halfway between the American bomber bases in the Marianas and the Japanese home islands. American B-29s flew over it twice per mission, once on their way to bomb Japan, once returning. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima could intercept those bombers. More importantly to the Americans, if they captured Iwo Jima, their fighters could escort the bombers all the way to Tokyo, and damaged B-29s would have an emergency landing site. Both sides understood what was at stake, which meant both sides would commit everything to this 8-square-mile piece of volcanic rock. Kuribayashi had studied the American invasions of Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu. He'd analyzed their tactics, their overwhelming firepower, their systematic approach to amphibious assault. And he'd reached a conclusion that horrified his superiors in Tokyo. The traditional Japanese defensive strategy was suicide. The traditional approach was to contest the beaches, to meet the American landing craft with maximum firepower, to die gloriously in banzai charges. It was emotionally satisfying, fit the warrior code, and accomplished nothing. The Americans would simply stand offshore and use their naval guns to annihilate beach defenses, then walk ashore over the bodies. Kuribayashi had proposed something different. Let them land, offer minimal resistance on the beaches. draw them inland into a network of tunnels, bunkers, and fortified positions where American firepower advantages would be neutralized. No banzai charges, no glorious last stands. Just methodical, grinding defensive warfare designed to kill as many Americans as possible before the inevitable end. Tokyo had hated the plan. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't proper. It violated every principle of Bushido, the warrior code. But Kuribayashi had been given command, and he implemented his strategy regardless. His men had dug 11 miles of tunnels through the volcanic rock, connecting hundreds of fortified positions. They'd positioned artillery and mortar in caves with multiple exits. They'd created a defensive network so dense that every yard of the island was covered by interlocking fields of fire. And it had worked. Terribly, efficiently, it had worked. The Americans had landed on February 19th. Kuribayashi had ordered his beach defenders to hold fire while the first waves came ashore. The Marines had landed expecting devastation, had found instead empty beaches. For 30 minutes, they'd advanced inland almost unopposed, confused by the lack of resistance. Then Kuribayashi had given the order to open fire. Every gun on the island had fired simultaneously. The American beachhead had become an instant killing ground. Marines dove behind whatever cover they could find, wrecked landing craft, shell craters, their own dead, and still they kept coming. Wave after wave, landing craft disgorging troops directly into the maelstrom. Kuribayashi had watched from his observation posts, had seen the Americans take casualties that would have broken any Japanese unit and simply continue advancing. They called in naval gunfire on Japanese positions, obliterating bunkers that had taken weeks to construct. They brought up tanks, flamethrower teams, demolition squads. They adapted, coordinated, pressed forward with mechanical efficiency. By nightfall of the first day, 30,000 Marines were ashore. Japanese casualties exceeded 2,000. American casualties were approaching 2,500. And Mount Suribachi, isolated at the southern tip of the island, had been cut off from the rest of the Japanese defenses. The battle for Suribachi had been everything Kuribayashi had feared and predicted. The Americans surrounded the mountain, brought up artillery and tanks, systematically destroyed every visible defensive position. His troops had fought from the tunnels, emerging to fire and then disappearing back underground. But the Americans had refined their tactics from previous island battles. They used flamethrowers to clear caves. They used demolitions to collapse tunnel entrances. They coordinated infantry, armor, and air support with devastating precision. Colonel Atsuchi, commanding the Suribachi garrison, had sent increasingly desperate messages. His communications were failing. His casualties were mounting. The Americans were closing in. But he was following orders, no banzai charges, just disciplined defensive fighting. Hold every position until it became untenable, then fall back to the next position. By February 23rd, the Americans had fought their way to the base of Suribachi summit. A patrol from the 28th Marines, 2nd Battalion, Easy Company, had been ordered to climb to the top and secure it. 40 men, led by First Lieutenant Harold Schreier, carrying rifles, radios, and a small American flag. They climbed through a landscape of death. The volcanic rock was pocked with shell craters. Bodies of Japanese defenders lay where they'd fallen. Wrecked equipment littered the slope. And at every cave entrance, at every fortified position, they'd expected fire. Some positions did fire. Lost-ditch defenders who fought until killed. But most were silent, already destroyed or abandoned. At 10:20 a.m., they'd reached the summit. Schreier's men had spread out, securing the area, checking caves. They'd found a length of pipe, probably from a Japanese water cistern, and lashed the flag to it. At 10:37 a.m., the flag had been raised. Below, on the beaches and across the island, Marines had stopped fighting to watch. Ships offshore had sounded their horns. Men who'd been under fire for 4 straight days who'd lost friends and seen things they'd never forget, had stood and cheered. The flag on Suribachi meant the southern end of the island was secure. It meant they were winning. In Tokyo, 660 miles north, the message about the flag reached Imperial headquarters at 3:15 p.m. By then, several hours had passed since the actual flag raising. The delay was due to damaged communications, the time required to encode and transmit, and the general chaos of the battle. Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso received the report in a meeting with the Supreme War Council. The message was brief, clinical. Mount Suribachi has fallen to enemy forces. American flag observed flying from summit at 10:37 hours local time. General Kuribayashi reports garrison casualties estimated 70%, remaining defenders withdrawing to secondary positions. American casualties estimated significant but not sufficient to halt operations. The room was silent. These were men who'd spent the entire war receiving reports of Japanese victories, then reports of tactical withdrawals, then reports of strategic defeats. But this was different in its symbolism. An American flag flying over Japanese territory. Not over a captured ship or a distant outpost, but over Japanese soil, visible to an entire American fleet. Admiral Selma Toyota, chief of the Naval General Staff, spoke first. How long has Kuribayashi estimated he can hold the remainder of the island? The aide who delivered the message consulted his notes. General Kuribayashi's last tactical assessment, transmitted 3 days ago, estimated 30 to 45 days of continued resistance if initial defense plans were successful. Given the fall of Suribachi after only 4 days, revised estimates are uncertain. Uncertain. Foreign Minister Shigenori Tug repeated the word softly. How diplomatic. The Americans have taken their objective in 4 days, and we're uncertain how long our garrison will last. Prime Minister Koiso's face was rigid. General Kuribayashi was selected for this command because of his expertise. His defensive strategy was approved at the highest levels. If Suribachi has fallen, it's because the American commitment exceeds our estimates. Toyota shook his head slowly. With respect, Prime Minister, the American commitment has exceeded our estimates at every engagement for the past year. At Saipan, at Guam, at Peleliu. We consistently underestimate their willingness to accept casualties and their ability to bring overwhelming force to bear. General Yashijiro Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff, bristled. Are you suggesting our forces are inferior? I'm stating that our forces are fighting with courage and determination that any nation would honor, Toyota replied. But courage doesn't destroy tanks. Determination doesn't stop naval bombardment. The Americans have assembled a fleet of over 800 ships for Iwo Jima. 800 ships. They've committed 3 Marine divisions, 60,000 men, to capture an island 8 square miles in area. That's 7,500 men per square mile. The mathematics are not in our favor. The argument that followed was familiar, had been repeated in variations at every War Council meeting for months. Some argued for continued resistance at all costs, for the warrior spirit that would overcome material disadvantages. Others, fewer and more quiet, suggested that perhaps it was time to consider negotiated settlement. But everyone in the room knew the Americans had demanded unconditional surrender. There was no negotiated settlement to be had. Talk brought the discussion back to the immediate issue. Regardless of our strategic situation, the flag on Suribachi presents a propaganda problem. The Americans will photograph it, publicize it, use it to demonstrate their momentum. Our people will see it. The image will spread. He was right. Already, American photographers had taken dozens of pictures of the flag raising. Joe Rosenthal of the Associated Press had captured a second flag raising later that morning, a larger flag brought up to replace the first, and his photograph would become one of the most famous images of the war. But the Japanese leadership didn't know about Rosenthal's photograph yet. They were still processing the basic fact. American flag on Japanese territory. Koiso stood, signaling the meeting's end. Inform General Kuribayashi that the Emperor has full confidence in his conduct of the defense. Tell him to continue resistance in accordance with his judgment, and, he paused, prepare a statement for the public. Something about the heroic defense of Iwo Jima, the sacrifice of our forces, the determination to defend every inch of Japanese territory. After the meeting, Tug remained behind with Admiral Toyota. They were among the few leaders who'd begun to privately acknowledge that Japan was losing the war. Not might lose. Was losing. The flag on Suribachi, Tug said quietly. It's symbolic of something larger, isn't it? Not just a tactical defeat, but a demonstration of capability. The Americans have the resources to assemble this fleet, to sustain this assault, to absorb casualties that would cripple us, and to continue pressing forward. 4 days to take Suribachi when we hope for 2 weeks. Toyota nodded. General Kuribayashi's assessment before the invasion was that he could hold Iwo Jima for 30 to 45 days. Perhaps longer if circumstances favored us. The Americans will probably take the entire island in 25 to 30 days at current pace. And then they'll move to the next objective. Okinawa, most likely. And after Okinawa, he didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what came after Okinawa. The home islands themselves. We're watching our defensive perimeter contract, Tug said. The Philippines, Iwo Jima, next Okinawa. Each battle brings them closer. And each battle demonstrates that they're willing to pay whatever price necessary to continue advancing. The Marines on Iwo Jima are taking horrific casualties. Kuribayashi's strategy is working in that sense, but they're not stopping. They're not even slowing down significantly. Toyota looked at the map on the wall, pins marking Japanese positions and American advances. Do you know what disturbs me most about the flag on Suribachi? Not that they raised it. That they raised it on the 4th day of the invasion. They were confident enough in their control of the area to stop fighting and have a flag ceremony. That's not the action of an army that's uncertain or overextended. That's the action of an army that knows it's winning. In his bunker on Iwo Jima, General Kuribayashi was thinking similar thoughts. The flag on Suribachi was flying because 40 American Marines had climbed to the summit under fire and decided that claiming the high ground was worth the risk. He'd read reports about American combat behavior throughout the war. They weren't blindly brave. They used cover, they coordinated their attacks, they relied heavily on firepower. But when the situation required it, individual Americans would take extraordinary personal risks to achieve objectives. That was what made them so difficult to fight. Japanese forces relied on collective action, on group cohesion, and following orders. American forces seemed to function at both levels simultaneously, coordinated mass tactics combined with individual initiative. Squads would maintain formation while individual Marines would charge machine gun nests with flamethrowers. Companies would advance under fire while individual soldiers would volunteer for patrol duty behind enemy lines. The flag on Suribachi represented both kinds of courage. The systematic, organized courage of a military machine that could coordinate naval bombardment, airstrikes, and ground assault. And the individual courage of 40 men climbing a mountain under fire to plant a flag on top. Kuribayashi had written letters throughout his command on Iwo Jima, letters to his wife and children that he knew he'd never be able to send. In one, written after learning about Suribachi, he'd been unusually candid. The Americans have raised their flag over the mountain. I watched through binoculars as our positions fired on them, and they continued climbing regardless. This is what we face. Not an enemy that attacks once and withdraws if repelled, but an enemy that attacks continuously, accepts casualties, adapts tactics, and never stops coming forward. I have prepared this island to extract the maximum price for their victory, but victory will be theirs. All I can do is make them pay dearly enough that perhaps, somewhere in their planning, they will hesitate before the next invasion. That was Kuribayashi's hope. Not to win, he knew winning was impossible, but to make the Americans pay such a high price for Iwo Jima that they might reconsider the invasion of Japan itself. To kill so many Marines that American public opinion might demand a negotiated settlement rather than the total conquest required for unconditional surrender. It wouldn't work. Kuribayashi suspected that even as he implemented his strategy, the Americans had demonstrated repeatedly that they would accept staggering casualties to achieve their objectives, but it was the only option available. Japan had chosen war and was now committed to fighting until it was physically impossible to continue. The battle for Iwo Jima would last 36 days total. American casualties would exceed 26,000, with nearly 7,000 killed. Japanese casualties would be nearly 100% of the garrison, 18,000 killed, fewer than 1,000 captured, most of those too wounded to resist. It would be one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. But on February 23rd, 4 days into the battle, with the flag flying on Mount Suribachi, the outcome was already determined. The only question was how long it would take and how many would die before the end came. In Tokyo, Japanese leaders looked at the reports and understood what the flag meant. Not just that Suribachi had fallen, but that American forces were now 660 miles from the home islands, with fighters and bombers based on an island they'd captured in less than a month. The defensive perimeter was collapsing. The war was entering its final phase. General Kuribayashi would die on Iwo Jima, killed in action on March 26th during one of the final defensive stands. His body was never found. Before his death, he sent one final message to Tokyo. The battle is approaching its end. We have inflicted serious casualties on the enemy and delayed their advance longer than anticipated, but the result was never in doubt. I pray this delay has value in the larger conduct of the war. It didn't. The Americans learned from Iwo Jima, refined their tactics, and moved on to Okinawa, where the pattern repeated. Fierce Japanese resistance, overwhelming American firepower, inevitable American victory. And after Okinawa came the atomic bombs and surrender. But the flag on Suribachi marked the moment when Japanese leaders could no longer deny the trajectory. The Americans weren't just winning. They were winning with such systematic efficiency that no amount of courage or sacrifice could change the outcome. The flag flew on Mount Suribachi because 40 Marines had climbed the mountain under fire and decided that claiming the summit mattered more than safety. And behind those 40 men stood 60,000 more, and behind them an industrial nation mobilized for total war. That was what Japanese leaders saw when they received the report about the flag. Not just a piece of cloth on a mountaintop, but a symbol of the inexorable force advancing toward their homeland, one island at a time, at a pace they couldn't stop, and a cost they'd proven unable to make prohibitive. The flag rose at 10:37 a.m. on February 23, 1945. By evening, everyone involved understood what it meant. The Americans celebrated. The Japanese acknowledged another step toward the inevitable end. And on Iwo Jima, the killing continued for another month, with neither side able to stop the machinery of war once it was set in motion.